That's what I want. So we are now recording. For those who might have just joined, my name is Kevin Van Meter. I use he and him pronouns. I'm the teaching fellow at the Scontra Center for Labor and Community Education at the University of Southern Maine. And we have a really fantastic event for you all tonight. A couple months ago, as per request of Maine labor leaders and rank and file workers, that we start talking about some of the recent developments that were happening around the United States and bring those to a Maine audience. We were also hearing from our community partners and labor leaders that it was really key to have winter events and book events. And of course, this is our first and hopefully many online book events for those here in the winter that are stuck at home in the snow as I am, and very excited to continue to learn about contemporary labor issues. This is a part of our series we're calling Conversations at the Scontra Center. I really had the pleasure of meeting with both of these authors yesterday and telling them a little bit more about the center and our conversation series, both online and at our in-person events at University of Southern Maine Portland campus, and of course, around the state. We're really looking to engage in robust conversation and not just have presentations, but hearing about the work that went into producing intellectual work or the kind of organizing that people are engaged in around the United States and, of course, here in the state. So we welcome you to our conversation series. Just quick introduction on the book itself. Rank and File Rebels, Theories of Power and Change in the 2018 Education Strikes is freely available online. And I know the authors will address that later as well. I encountered the book posted, I believe, on Facebook and the like. I was very excited to read the introduction and the preface. It's a very rich text that not just covers this strike wave, but also some of the really deep issues around race and gender and class. And of course, the challenges that educators are currently facing. So I posted in the chat a link to the book itself. It's easily Googleable. Certainly, please take a time if you haven't already to explore the book and read the book. I'm going to introduce both of our authors, and I'm going to hand it over to them. Erin Dyke is an associate professor of curriculum studies at Oklahoma State University. Her primary line of research examines the pedagogies, organizing, and impacts of contemporary educator movements on educational practice and policy. And of course, Erin and our other author have published widely on these issues, not just in the book, but elsewhere. Erin has published ethnographic studies of liberatory curriculum and pedagogy in Educational Studies, International Journal of Multicultural Education, and the Journal of Education Human Resources. Our additional author is Brendan Muckian-Bates, who is a former West Virginian public educator turned nonprofit worker. His specialization is gender studies, critical pedagogy, and social studies education. His work has appeared in Jacobin, Berkeley Review of Education, and New Politics. And I welcome them both to our first online Conversations at the Scontra Center, and I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for that introduction. I wanted to kick things off by starting with West Virginia and some of the stories that we include in the beginning of our book to really highlight the background for a lot of what you'll read about. And I want to start with a story from a teacher from Mason County, Brianne Solomon, who stated that, quote, "My school in my county had even lower morale than what I consider the state's average of low morale. So we were lower than low. People were afraid, and that showed itself in defensiveness, standoffish behavior, refusal to comment, and tension." And I start with that quote because I think it really highlights the feeling that many educators and public employees they've had for many years leading up to this strike, feelings of hopelessness, feelings of an inability to affect change, and the reliance that our state had on either direct lobbying with the state legislature or the governor, very direct electoral campaigns and the attempt to um, raise awareness for the absurdly low wages that educators in the state face, the multitude of challenges that educators face from social, psychological impacts, the opioid epidemic, and these compounding issues that educators were routinely sort of tasked with dealing with in their classroom. And I think it's important also to really preface what we're going to say by acknowledging that those feelings of hopelessness and low morale and defeatism are usually what a lot of organizers understand in the lead up to some very significant actions that really the take center stage. And it's important to sort of recognize when we as organizers feel that sort of sense of low morale and defeat, because we're recognizing where we're going to slowly begin to um, take back our power. And so, in the summer of 2017, myself and dozens of other educators within our NEA, our state NEA local WVEA, met at the delegate assembly. We met with Governor Justice, who at the time was a Democrat, and saw sort of what the lay of the land would be for the next legislative session in 2018. And, there were feelings that the old ways had kind of not necessarily worked. We weren't in a strong position as a union necessarily. And Jay, who's on here right now, actually reached out to me over Facebook and asked if, was interested in joining a sort of growing Facebook group that he and others between NEA and AFC were working on, these rank and file educators. And initially, it was a very small secret Facebook group that was focused primarily on sort of spreading information and getting folks connected to share stories and explain, what common issues educators across the state were facing. And the buildup was going to be initially towards like a larger lobby day that really hadn't did as much and hadn't gotten as much attention from rank and file educators in the past. A lobby day that would actually include many of the concerns that were starting to be shared on the Facebook group. And over time, the group, I believe, started with only maybe a few dozen people and expanded, I think, by the time the strike happened, into around 20,000. So it was a very important space for education workers to share their concerns and express their interest in taking some action. And so the talk of a strike slowly started to come out as people realized that Governor Justice switched from Democrat to Republican. Republicans had trifecta control of the legislature. It became increasingly clear that our public employee insurance system was going to face significant cuts. There were going to be increased premiums, deductibles. The pay increase that was proposed would not even come anywhere close to, closing that gap. And so, as this talk progressed, the president of WBEA at the lobby day said, essentially, expressed that he had heard talks of strikes and that we needed to do some more build up to that. And after the lobby day, we saw on the page a lot of people were sharing their experiences and sort of highlighting the fact that these lawmakers really didn't fully understand the issues that they were voting on. And through continued agitation, the unions, WBEA, AFT, and the Service Personnel Union gathered together and sent out authorization votes to all the counties in the state. And with that strike authorization vote, I think it was somewhere around like 90% or more, it said, yes, we authorize the union to call a strike. And, at first, no one truly knew what was going to happen. We didn't know how long this was going to take place. There was no, effective deadline, and public employees, we didn't have the right to strike. And so for the first few days at the Capitol, it was very eventful. Educators across the state showed up, held signs, very raucous, exciting activity. Um, but as the days went on, fewer and fewer people started to attend, and it appeared as though the legislature was taking note of this and felt that the strike would end fairly quickly, and they could just continue with the proposed cuts that they had. Um, and then Governor Justice eventually took a sort of tour of the state to see what educators were talking about. And in this tour, it went very poorly. He sort of traveled from high school to high school in a helicopter, and would sort of talk back to educators when they brought up their concerns, calling them dumb bunnies, rednecks, very just abusive, like confrontational language. And the pretty much as soon as he made his third stop, people were sharing what had been discussed at these meetings on that Facebook group, and it became very clear that the governor was clearly not interested in listening to what educators had to say about these proposals. Um, Eventually, he 2 days later, he came out with the union leadership and said, we have a proposed agreement. We're going to have a cooling off day. I recognize that education should be an investment like any other state investment. So we're going to go back to the drawing board, and we're going to fix some of these issues. But since nothing was set in stone, because there was no kind of agreement that could be legally binding, there was nothing that actually held the legislature to that proposed agreement. And word started to circulate that the Senate Majority Chair, Mitch McConnell, had gone on, I believe it was Talkline Radio, sort of the largest, radio platform in the state, and said, I really think this is going to pass the Senate. And so it was very clear that this was just an attempt to mitigate the very real threat that the strike would continue, sort of in continuity. So the word very quickly spread, and as superintendents were calling parents, let them know that, hey, the strike has ended, the school resumed back in session the following day. We started to watch this map where we would see all the counties slowly turn red because they were called off due to the strike. And on the cooling off day, we saw the counties start to fill in red again because teachers were refusing to go back to work, service personnel were refusing to go back to work. And that was the wildcat moment where educators in these secret meetings sort of pushed back and said, no, we're not going to accept this. It's clearly not something that the legislature is willing to agree to. And one of the educators that we interviewed out of Culver, his point of view was, quote, outside of West Virginia, I hope our story continues to inspire other teachers and workers to fight for what should be theirs. And as much as the story is about classism, capital accumulation, social movement, it's also just about keeping promises and taking care of the people who are taking care of your world. It takes everyone to make this world work, and no one who's contributing should be struggling. And because of those actions, that fire of rebellion that we start the book with begins to spread. And so that's sort of the catalyst for what we begin to talk about. But I wanted to really start with that to kind of frame what Erin and I will be talking about. So Erin, feel free to take it away.
Yeah, so I'll pick up like chronologically after that. So West Virginia was first, and in Oklahoma, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, there had been talks and serious talks around trying to start a statewide walkout at least a year prior. But it wasn't until West Virginia went out that I think it became really realistic, like this is going to happen. We are going to do this. And so here in Oklahoma, I'm in teacher education. I was that semester, that spring 2018 semester, I was in a class with about a dozen teachers in a master's level class. And we kind of shifted the class to really just focus on the impending strike, because that's all we could think about. That's all we were worried about. The folks in the class were like balls of anxiety, and sort of like that sometimes manifested with like physical symptoms. They were just like felt so unprepared. They had this image of, consuming the story of West Virginia from afar, as though, West Virginia teachers had a clear plan. They were very organized. They were way more experienced. They were somehow, up here, and they felt like really unprepared. And so then through a union friend got in touch with Brendan and invited him to Zoom into my class, maybe just a week or two after their strike had ended, and was able to share those stories and those experiences. And I think then the teachers in the class were really like, oh, yeah, they're just like us. We're just like them. Like this is this is just, it's messy. There's a lot of uncertainty, also a lot of like um, excitement and energy, and like those shows of solidarity of being, elbow to elbow with your coworkers on the line. And so I think that really helped. And in that class started sort of the seeds of my and Brendan's co-research relationship, and also an oral history project that I embarked on with some of the folks in that class and other teachers across the state. And I think, in conversations in that class, realizing that, educators in West Virginia and in Oklahoma had gone on a statewide strike in 1990, and there wasn't really a collective memory of that experience in Oklahoma, especially. There, folks in the class either didn't know that it had happened, or maybe just only the basic facts of what had happened. And if you look into it, there isn't really much writing about it. There's some news stories. You can kind of pull up some archives, and there's like a really brief super 90s 30-minute documentary produced by the Oklahoma Education Association that's very basic, but there's, you don't have those firsthand experiences. And so we wanted to create a record. We wanted to document some of those experiences. And I know in West Virginia, there's also an oral history project that some folks undertook and interviewed. I think Jay was interviewed as part of that. And so just kind of recording those experiences and narratives from the perspectives of the people who organized in those places. So I think that was what really drove both the oral history project and then Brendan and I working together. We didn't really anticipate writing a book. It's hard to even remember that far back. I don't know. We were just like, we need to interview people. We need to learn. And then we just started reading together and thinking together. And then the opportunity for this book came about. That was a free and open access book that was really geared towards had this open access mission, and the series editors for the book were longtime higher education union organizers who we knew would be really supportive of our project. And it took a long time to come to fruition. Part of that was COVID, but I think also that the longer time period was helpful in sort of, it gave Brendan and I time to do more reading and thinking, and sort of seeing how our ideas played out, having conversations with people. So we interviewed around 28 people in the 4 states that we focus on: Oklahoma, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Oklahoma. And then in Oklahoma, we conducted 54 oral history interviews with educators across the state. And that is sort of the basis of our book. But then we also include and try to historicize a lot of things in the book as well. So, and to do some analysis. So I'm going to switch now to frame some of the key ideas in the book. And then Brendan and I will tell some stories to kind of that will hopefully illustrate some of those ideas. So the book is really organized. It's in the title, Theories of Power and Change. And so we, just like in teaching, we have a pedagogy or a philosophy or approach to teaching that sort of informs, our, the decisions that we make around how we organize our curriculum, how we relate to students, that kind of thing. Similarly, we have theories of organizing, of working with other people in our communities to create change. And so we call it theories of power and change, or unionism. So, most people might think of a union as, just a state recognized, NLRB recognized organization that collectively bargains. But, we're thinking about unionism as both a theory and a practice in the book. And so we draw on some different traditions of thinking about unionism and try to make those accessible and try to see those and see through those lenses to help us understand what's happening. So two really important traditions or ways of thinking about unionism that we draw on in the book are solidarity unionism. So solidarity unionism is, as a lens, it helps us to think about how and why these, as Brendan sort of
Recording in progress.
As Brendan illustrated in his story, that these movements really came from the periphery or sort of outside the formal state unions. The state unions were hesitant, really, in a lot of places. Eventually supported, but we're hesitant to engage in these, and these really came from rank and file sort of organizing in tension with their state unions. And solidarity unionism draws on traditions of thinking informed by industrial unionism, poor workers movements, I'm going to pull up my notes here, where, it's predicated on radical democratic participation of its members, and is often anti-capitalist and anti-racist. It operates from this very basic idea that a union is a group of two or more workers who act together to improve their working conditions. Essentially, if you decide that you're a union, you're a union. And in the traditions of thinking and practicing solidarity unionism, that solidarity unionism is attentive to and sort of critical of the limits of legal impositions on workers' ability to organize, and really understands that workers' power comes from their ability to withhold their labor in order to transform their working conditions. So this sort of ground up solidarity ways of thinking. So that's one lens and like tradition of literature and organizing that we're drawing from to help us see what's happened in these places. And then we also draw on social movement unionism, particularly within education. So education is a very specific kind of industry. It's a cultural institution of social reproduction. It's often a place where we see social and economic policies play out in this sort of microcosm of life in our schools and in our communities. And as long as education unions have been around, social movement unionism in education has been around. So educator unionists have often organized with the early women's movements to the early 20th century communist and socialist movements to civil rights movements, and also contemporary movements for Black lives around food justice, climate justice, and things like that. And so social movement just is sort of a lens that helps us to understand that the depression of educators' wages, the state disinvestment in public education and school privatization tactics, from privatization of schools to curriculum and assessment, that these are the sort of the source of educators' grievances in these places, that these are fundamentally also entwined with racist economic and social policies and the devaluation of feminized care work in education, among other things, right? So social movement unionism seeks to sort of be accountable to those wider social movements that also are a part of and impact schools and schooling in society. Another like important approach that we take in the book is try to really be to historicize. So, often in education, like in teacher preparation programs and the profession of teaching, we have access to narratives of teachers as professionals, respectable professionals, often in pretty narrow forms of professionalism. And then we have access to narratives of teachers as classroom managers, as caregivers, as sacrificers for the good of children and society, but we don't have a lot of strong narratives, and access to teachers as workers. And access to these longer histories of understanding how teachers have organized as workers to form teachers unions, to form one of the largest public sector unions in the US, and and to carry these stories forward. And so we wanted to carry these stories forward and to understand how those histories and legacies continue to shape education in these places and these struggles. And then likewise, we wanted to really geographically situate these struggles in these states. In Appalachian region, it has a very particular cultural sort of history and culture that teachers wearing red bandanas to their strike were not necessarily gestures to like the Red for Ed movement, the wider education movement, but were gestures to and shows of solidarity with mine workers movements in the state. So thinking about how those regional and geographic histories shaped these struggles was really important as well. And also because a lot of studies around educator union and labor struggles have often centered on major northern and coastal urban areas. So we have books and histories around New York and New Jersey and Detroit and Chicago and LA and other places, but really these struggles were quite different. They were statewide strikes. They weren't like major urban districts. They were where the main target is the district leadership negotiating a contract, a more favorable contract. These were educators who were in right to work states who were targeting their state legislators to make demands, and they were engaging in illegal strikes, illegal actions. So it was important for us to be, to situate ourselves in these places because they are relatively understudied in this literature around educator unions and education labor. So we're going to tell some stories here and talk a little bit more specifically about what happened in each of these states. And in doing so, try to illustrate both how solidarity unionism was like an important lens that we can understand these sort of rank and file movements and how they operated. And then also, thinking about, important in the book is to bring gender and race to the fore and class to the fore as well, to understand how these played a role in these struggles in different places. And so try to cue to and illustrate some of those dynamics that were in play in these places. So I'll turn it over to Brendan now.
Yeah, and I'll give sort of a brief overview of the cultural and political geography and makeup of West Virginia and Kentucky to sort of compare and contrast what we see happen in those states during their statewide strikes in 2018 and in 2019. And so to start, I'll start with West Virginia. And West Virginia is the only state that is entirely within Appalachia. It is therefore a very primarily rural state with few cities. No city in the state has more than 50,000 residents. So it is a predominantly rural state, and it is also mostly white, around 97%. And we go a bit into sort of the reason for some of these demographics and the history of that and its relationship to other industries that are also relevant in within education. It's a state with a declining population, but it does have a very deep history of unionism and sort of like what Erin was talking about with the red bandanas. Those were worn during the mine wars in at the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921, sort of the culmination of this series of strike actions against coal barons in the southern coal fields of the state, and culminating in this very climactic physical battle, the largest insurrection in the country since the Civil War. and pitting union members who were going south to help unionize the non-union coal fields against the coal barons and their privatized sheriffs and deputies. And so the legacy of unionism in West Virginia has been sort of suppressed in a lot of ways, whether it was through legislative decrees that attempted to tamp down on any history of retelling, the labor uprisings in the early 1900s, whether it was rampant union busting, and so the state itself has a very strong sense of sort of this working class versus wealthy elite mentality. There's a strong sense of cross-union solidarity between educators and other industries. One example is, as Erin mentioned, the 1990 strike that took place in West Virginia. The 1990 strike actually took place directly after the famous UMWA Pittston coal strike that lasted about a year, and had some very significant confrontations, often violent, between coal miners and the owners. And so educators relied very heavily in the 2018 strike on the presence of a lot of these UMWA members who came out in support of them, who showed that they were deeply supportive of what educators were doing, that this was not sort of a teachers versus everyone else situation. This was a working class versus a small wealthy elite strike. And so educators did not necessarily see themselves, in the public perception was not that these were just greedy teachers who were out for themselves. This was a strike that really brought in a lot of direct community and cross-union support. And so while in the state, like in West Virginia, just as Kentucky, there's a long history of Democrats sort of in trifecta control of the governor, House of Delegates, and state Senate, but was very immediately followed by Republican control in 2014 and 2016. But this has only really helped to shape the political terrain, where there's sort of this long history of distrust of politicians overall, with very relatively low voter turnout. And in comparison, Kentucky is a bit of a mix between rural and urban centers. And we talk about this in the book, and I'll go into this a bit further here in a minute, but the organizing that took place in Kentucky, where there was sort of this growing disconnect between what became known as KY 120, which was a statewide organization that was attempting to connect all 120 counties in the state, rural and urban. There was a very direct focus on trying to keep as many counties together. And so you had counties in eastern Kentucky that are very similar in terms of like geographic and political makeup as southern West Virginia, where the 2018 strike really originated in a lot of ways with that history of unionism. And a history in Jefferson County and Louisville of social justice movements, Black Lives Matter, and this difference in geography and political makeup is something we'll get into here in a bit. But just like in West Virginia, Kentucky also had a very unpopular governor, Governor Bevin, who was elected in 2015. And just like in West Virginia, Kentucky public employees felt that the lobbying effects were fairly ineffective. They weren't really impacting legislative change, and so there was a need for new leadership in the minds of many educators and public employees. And I'll start with one story to kind of highlight how what was taking place in West Virginia was also happening in Kentucky, sort of simultaneously, but without any direct contact between the two states. And so in Kentucky, a social worker, Katie Hancock, started a Facebook group similar to West Virginia called United We Stand. And this was an attempt to share very similar stories of this governor's warpath, essentially, to decimate public employees' pension plans. Public employees like Katie had no real legal protection for voicing this discontent. And so they felt that this was the best way to provide education and support about Bevan's plan. They had a rally in November of 2017. They were able to block this special session attempt to decimate the pension system, and eventually what Katie's page turned into is what became the statewide organization KY 120. And to follow up with that, I think there's something interesting where we talk about sort of the difference in the theories of power and change between some of these different surveyed states. And in one interview I did with a teacher in Louisville, James, he witnessed what he saw sort of this political shift as a result of this direct organizing. And I'm paraphrasing what he said here, but he goes into detail about how, you know, if you're playing in the NFL and you put up like a high school team against, you know, a practice NFL team, you're going to lose 100% of the time, right? Because they have this inbuilt advantage. And he saw the advantage that politicians in the state had and the disadvantages that a lot of public employees and other unions had, where they were attempting to continue to fight this NFL team on the same terrain with the same tactics that they used. And he said, you know, that's essentially not going to work. But if you change the tactics and if you change up the strategy and you recognize where your power is, then you can beat that team. And for him, what he wanted to see was everyone of every trade, of every union, every background coming together 365 days a year, being an ally in the struggle, building power, not just when elections came around, but consistently. That's how you carve out your own political power. Because he recognized, you know, you can't really sue your way out of the gerrymandered districts. You can't sue your way out of the changes that the state is attempting to impose upon you. And this is contrasted a bit with another educator who we spoke to, Jenny Bolander, who's also a educator and organizer in the state. And her understanding of building power was through building relationships with political leaders, because in her mind, they needed this relationship to help win fights when needed, that strikes were effective if done with very specific intent. But if you sort of strike every year, that the legislators will only see you as sort of this angry mob and not directly advocating for what you want to believe, what you believe in. And so for her, strikes were effective, but had to be sort of limited in scope and very specific when you utilize that tool. Whereas the primary focus should be on developing that relationship and building power politically through elections and endorsements. And what we did was we wanted to compare how each of these different states and their organizations understood their relationship to their legislatures. And so we did we took an international lens here, and we compared sort of the work of these educator organizers in Southern Mexico, the National Coordination of Education Workers in the 1970s, took on very direct militant alternatives to the Mexican trade union for educators. And it was very similar to the Zapatista movement, this very direct democracy, anarchist style movement that did not see themselves as directly working with the state. And we compared it to the Brazilian landless workers movement, which was very much a movement, that is a movement that seeks power both directly in communities as well as at the state. And so we use those two comparisons to look at how these the organizations that were built in these states identified within their respective power struggles. And I'll very briefly just kind of cover like what that looks like on the ground. And so in West Virginia, the rank and file group, West Virginia United, saw its movement as one that had to be separate from electoral politics and parties. It had to be focused on the job and commit to a very democratic structure. Labor actions were seen as like the the quintessential way of exerting and building power. And the benefit of that was seen very directly by those we interviewed. A local county president, Jenny Craig, had mentioned that teachers are seeing themselves as part of a larger whole. They're workers that have something more in common with each other. And when other strikes were taking place sort of simultaneous to the 2018 teacher strikes, others had also said as much that, if the teachers can win, so can we. However, at the midterms, the Republicans maintained control, and so even though there was this massive strike action, Democrats gained some seats but still weren't in the majority. And others that we interviewed, like Emily Homer, a teacher in Kanawha County in Charleston, the capital, said essentially, it's not our job to elect Democrats; it's their job to elect Democrats. We're here to build power in our workplace. And if they can't take what we're giving them and sort of build a policy around that, then that's their fault. And so you see this very direct distinction in West Virginia between what education workers are doing versus what political parties are doing. This very direct distinction between the two. And Kentucky, a lot of the reason why that was so different was there was this attempt, as I mentioned before, like KY 120 wanted to create a statewide unified whole. So when these strikes took place in 2018 and 2019, KY 120 would be sort of the organization that called for strikes and then was the one that said when you had to go back. But it was a very sort of white-led organization that didn't account for the concerns in Louisville and in Jefferson County. And because of that, the tension sort of increased. And two prominent Black educators that we interview had said as much that because they were so outspoken in wanting to see this connection between social justice unionism and direct action, and were being stonewalled by their leadership, that it made them feel much more disenchanted with that experience with their union leadership. Tyra Walker had said as much that she was blocked from the KY 120 United group when she brought up issues that were being passed through the legislature in Kentucky, the gang crime bill, which was very directly targeted at Black students. KY 120 said, no, that's too divisive. We don't want to talk about it. And so by not building that direct relationship with Black educators and recognizing the concerns they had, KY 120 became very much a platform that really saw itself as, KY 119, that Jefferson County was essentially left out of the equation. And that's how a lot of educators in that county felt as well. And so this all just sort of explains, and I think in some ways, where those divisions politically, racial, geographically, sort of converged, where without being able to truly be united in some of these cases, those things started to fall away and mistrust began to increase. But being able to compare those two states, I think, was really important for us in this book, because it allows us to really highlight why these issues are so intertwined in organizing. So Erin, please feel free to jump in and discuss Oklahoma and Arizona stories as well.
Yeah, just for the sake of time, I'll just briefly mention one example that helps us to understand gender and gendered labor in the strikes too. Brendan talked a lot about the relationship between the rank and file membership and their orientation to how to make change, and the relationship to electoral politics. And I just want to talk for a second about the gendered relational labor that was really important in making these strikes happen in different places. And I think in our chapter on gender in the book, we really focus on Oklahoma, because this was really very apparent in Oklahoma. But Oklahoma, like, teaching is mostly white women. In high schools, it's a little bit more even, but in elementary school and special ed, it's like something like 90% women. And so, and I think it's important to share some of these stories of, so in the book, we talk a little bit about, so Rebecca Gorelli is here. So we talk a little bit about, she was an amazing organizer and is an amazing organizer in Arizona. But the work, that amazing, important work that Rebecca, Vanessa, and other folks in Arizona Educators United did to collect and engage in this democratic infrastructure of their liaison network. And when I interviewed Vanessa, one of the organizers, AEU, she talked in detail about just the administrative work of of managing communications and you know, maintaining spreadsheets and all this like tedious work of organizing, right? That's like crucial, but you know, really important. And then there were some tensions between folks who were doing that kind of work, and I'll talk specifically about Oklahoma here. And also tensions between some folks who were sort of more visible as leaders on some of the Facebook groups. And in particular in Oklahoma, that became a problem because of the person who managed our sort of major Facebook group that was sort of seen as sort of this organizing space where educators sort of ignited and were motivated to go on a strike. It was very hierarchically managed by one person, and he was very comfortable sort of positioning himself as a leader in the strike, and sort of took a lot of press interviews. And he not only was comfortable, he was also kind of thrust in that position at the same time as well, and sort of cast as a leader. But at the same time, so Oklahoma didn't have this sort of networked, more democratic communications infrastructure that folks in Arizona built, or that Jay and Brendan, you know, helped to facilitate in West Virginia. And so things were happening in sort of siloed ways. And so Oklahoma, like I said, had been talking about engaging in a walkout for up to a year prior. We're sort of at the end of the line. And you know, a lot of the folks in their specific districts did a lot of work to organize and actually realize those actions, sort of set the stage for it and to realize those actions. So in Stillwater, for example, educators had been meeting informally for the whole academic year, informally around shared grievances they had in their local district that sort of spiraled and became sort of the locus of organizing in Stillwater. And then in other places, oh, I feel like we're running out of time. I know you popped right on to give me my 5-minute warning. That's okay. And then so organizing things like local pickets, shared childcare, food distribution, mentoring new teachers into the issues and sort of taking people under their wings, organizing transportation to the Capitol, organizing actions above and beyond what was planned. So that's what folks did in these local places, and they had to set up their sort of own infrastructure for communicating. Often, either that was like group messaging apps, or that was private Facebook groups that were specific to their local community. And so in Oklahoma, the OEA was, and this is part of the tension with the sort of tensions between rank and file movements and the state unions, especially, is that the state unions in these right to work places were pretty weak. Membership had dropped significantly since 2001 in Oklahoma. Brendan goes into detail describing what it would actually take for a regional organizer in West Virginia to actually go and visit, you know, and have conversations with all the buildings and districts that they're assigned in their region, right? It's you know, it's not possible in many ways for all of that, you know, direct democratic organizing to take place within the resources that union has access to at the moment. And so the unions sort of operated as sort of managers. They felt responsible for educators. They wanted to maintain these however precarious and one-sided relationships they had with legislators to and sort of so when it came to pass, the strike was announced. Legislators passed a very small, meager pay increase and nothing else. And educators went on strike. 2 weeks went by, they were still on strike. And legislators started getting antsy, superintendents started getting antsy. They wanted educators to get back into their buildings. And they said, okay, you've had your fun. It's time to end it. And so eventually when the union did call the strike off, they had not won any additional gains. And there was a lot of anger and resentment towards the union. One educator, amazing educator in Moore, had learned of this, educators had also had lots of experiences being having experiences and interactions with legislators where they were had very misogynistic comments hurled at them. One educator in Moore, who was a leader, was called a grandstanding witch, and so lots of these kinds of things were happening publicly, and then in our interviews. But at the same time, Angel then, went when her district was called off. She ended up organizing a wildcat strike in her district for one day. She was so upset and anger, and folks felt like they were just starting to figure things out and get organized and knew what they were doing, realized that they were there to create the sense of pressure, and felt like they were really getting better at what they were trying to do. And then the rug was pulled out from underneath them. So I guess in my rambly story about Oklahoma, I wanted to emphasize the point that lots of really important, often devalued, gendered, tedious labor went into organizing these local places. Often these teachers in these local places were really community embedded teachers who drew on their relational networks that they had built through community organizing or through just being these like super teachers who knew everybody in their children in their districts, right? And that this labor was the foundation of the strike in Oklahoma, and they lacked that sort of networked communication that places like Arizona or other places had to push back when the rug was sort of pulled out from underneath them, and it caused this sense of demobilization afterwards and burnout and lots of really bad feelings. But in the aftermath, and we can maybe I know I'm going to wrap it up. We can talk about that more. But there's also a lot of really important things that were built and continue to happen, and lives were changed in really amazing ways as well. Folks became organizers, folks became more active, locals became more robust. There was organization to push back against pandemic policies that wasn't there earlier. And so things happened that were, in one way you could look at as a failure in Oklahoma, but in another way you could see how these networks, what people have learned have carried forward as well and impacted people and events and things in really important ways.
I'm going to jump in here. My hand movements were excitement.
I
I'm
was like,
so excited. This is my terrible East Coastness coming out. Yeah, and I know one of these questions is coming, and I have it as well. We'd love to hear kind of an update, especially after 2018, the pandemic happened, where the state of organizing now, and some of those other things. Would you both like to speak to that?
Yeah, do you want to start, Erin?
Sure, I can start. And I don't know if Rebecca is there or Jay should jump in too, because they probably have lots to say about it as well. But in Oklahoma, at least, union membership dropped significantly in the aftermath of the strike because of what happened here. And there was a large sense of burnout and frustration. We are dealing with a significant teacher shortage crisis right now, and the way things ended with the strike and then following into the pandemic didn't help. But there were also a lot of examples, like I said, of organizing in local places that responded to health and safety policies. The person who organized the Wildcat strike and more, she went on to organize. We actually Arizona Educators United helped to, I don't know the whole story of how National Educators United formed, but I know that Rebecca was involved with that. And so a national group and lots of other sort of state educator united groups formed, and they did National Educators United, which Rebecca was really involved with, went on to help people to respond to their COVID, return to learn policies that were ultimately often not really, safe for educators or students in many places. There was this sort of push to go back to normal in the aftermath, and so especially in places like Oklahoma, which barely did anything, in terms of like masking or, is very, very much nothing going on over here, right, during that time. And so Angel and others organized with support from the National Educators United organization, stayed connected and organized an action to push back against their return to learn policies. And so there's examples of things like that. But in terms of like state level organization or the maintenance of, the sort of statewide networks of people, there's nothing formally in play in Oklahoma in particular. But I'll turn it over to Brendan because I think there's more to say about certainly West Virginia and Kentucky.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say actually about what happened after 2018, so I will try to keep this brief. I think the two most important things to really highlight first with West Virginia was um, there was a charter school bill that was put forward in 2019, and the Rank and File Caucus, West Virginia United, did an excellent job of doing some organizational outreach and education on how privatization of public education really harms students, families, and communities, and push the unions to once again take a strike action and shut down um, all but one county in 2019 and effectively defeated the charter school bill. However, the legislature just put it back up over the summer in a special session and knew that teachers couldn't strike then, and so it passed. And that was really a sort of wake up moment, I think, for West Virginia United and other groups that were kind of upset that this had gone through, that the focus was then shifted towards, okay, well, let's just worry about the November 2020 election rather than sort of making a statement that if this passes, school will not start in the fall. And so there was a very deep sense that direct action can win the day, and threats of direct action would win focusing on elections. And as a result of that organizing, West Virginia United put up a group of educators for union leadership in WVEA, garnering, I think, around 40% of the vote, which was one of the first contested elections, especially for president, in many decades. And it was a very significant shift in momentum. However, COVID-19 made it very difficult to kind of get everyone together and work collaboratively as would have been able to in quote unquote normal circumstances. But that's not to say that it was necessarily a defeat. A few years later, actually, just last year now, West Virginia University, the flagship university, had very significant budget shortfalls of around $45 million. They were planning on laying off 150 faculty and cutting dozens of degree programs. But many of the undergraduate and graduate students and faculty and staff who had been supportive of the 2018 and 2019 strikes here had learned from those experiences, and students and faculty showed up in force against President Gordon Gee, the president of West Virginia University, and really took those experiences, whether they were students at the time or not, to shut down many of the Board of Governors meetings that he had put forward. They did great public education on the problems of these budget cuts. And so you can see in a lot of ways, I think, this continuity that we're trying to highlight, where the mine wars in the early 1900s, the 1990 strikes, that in 2018, 2019, and then 2023, that organizing here is sort of a continuation of the events preceding it, and everyone kind of builds off of them. And it's easy sometimes to see when those effects go into place as defeats, but there's experiences you can gain to build off of those afterwards. And in Kentucky as well, KY120, the statewide organization, eventually decided to affiliate with AFT and build an AFT local in the state. I don't believe there really was much presence prior to that. And so they're now more directly affiliated with a union, and I believe NEMA is one of their organizers. Jefferson County, where Louisville is, changed a bit. They created their own sort of offshoot group, JCPS, Jefferson County Public Schools United, or JCPS Leads, I'm sorry, and very much wanted the state to recognize the unique challenges that Jefferson County faces in 2019. So these groups kind of split, morphed, changed a bit, and, you know, continue to exist to this day. But, you know, COVID and recent pushback against educators, especially for taking these strike actions, have certainly taken their toll on keeping members and keeping them active and engaged.
Thank you. And I know we have a question from Michael, but certainly want to offer for Jay or Rebecca to join the conversation.
Well, I was going to direct my question perhaps first to Rebecca, which is that I was able to read the prologue and the epilogue, and that plus what I heard here today gave me the picture that of any of the states, it seems like the outcome for building worker power and organization that's more ongoing than some of the other places that had these various disruptions and disappointments. I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the sort of the most optimistic story of where things were and where they are now is Arizona. So if my premise is correct, what are the sort of special circumstances about Arizona? What's the story of Arizona that really makes that the case?
Well, I wasn't planning to speak, but hey guys, and I'm driving, so that's why you don't see my face. But I've got AirPods on, so I hope everyone's comfortable with me doing this right now.
Absolutely.
All right, so wow, I feel like I haven't talked about this in a minute. I feel like, okay, so I think sometimes when I talk about this with people, it's about our positionality in the sequence of the movement, right? And we were 4th out of 4. And so why I think this is an important thing to consider is our union worked very well with us because they had learned their lesson from the previous experiences in the other 3 states. And we also, we built our own power outside of the union. So for reference, there's 60,000 teachers here, certified teachers that were in the classrooms at the time. Only 1/3 of them were actually union dues paying members, so 20,000. By the time we were done with our 8-week organizing blitz and all those spreadsheets Vanessa helped handle, we organized 57,000 teachers. And we had over 2,000 volunteers. We called them site liaisons. They were basically served as union stewards or union reps in over 1,200 schools. And while the union did help us build that, we had a lot of our own lists and a lot of our own structures outside of the union. And that made a really big difference here. So when I think of over the past, almost 6 years now, or I don't even know how many years it's been, you guys, 5 years now, whatever it is, we never stopped organizing. We kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And there was so much momentum here for so many years because our core group, including myself, never quit. I barely am just sundowning the project right now. We did a book study over the summer. We sent out t-shirts and everybody got a copy of Secrets of a Successful Organizer. We did that over the summer. And, so we're still actively moving, but what changed is we have new union leadership. Marisol Garcia is now the president, who, really, I believe, wants to do all the right things and build power. And I don't know if you've been watching what she's doing, but she actually has built membership now and the highest growth in all of the unions in NEA for the past year. So I really believe that our pushing for so many years, because the previous president, Joe Thomas, and this is my own personal opinion, and sorry if anyone's friends with him and all of that stuff, is that he really thought we were going to come in and leave. And he even said, like, well, we have to be cautious as the union because we have to be here tomorrow. And I was like, I don't know what you're thinking, but I'm not fucking going anywhere. Like that, we're here. We're not going anywhere. Like, this place is terrible and this is not going to change overnight. And I, for one, am not going anywhere. So sorry for the F-bomb, but I get really excited about this topic. And so I think the change in leadership is a great thing. I really think we built, as Erin had mentioned, so many people who had never organized before are still organizing. They became local presidents. They became their site reps. People that served as our liaisons stepped in and are working in community organizations like Save Our Schools, who fights vouchers here. Like 4 of the people that organized for them were our liaisons, and that was their first touch at organizing experience. So I think we brought a new kind of organizing mindset, and that's my personal opinion. And we didn't quit. We're still kind of going, still to this day. So I will be quiet now. Thanks for listening.
I think it's important to note also, and we write about this in the book too, that Rebecca used to be a Chicago Public Schools teacher and was a teacher during the 2012 Chicago Teachers Union strike, which was a huge event at the time because it was the first time that there was a major teacher strike in decades, really, that had that much attention, and was also a strike, if you're not familiar, that was an action that was organized by the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, which had just a couple years previously had won leadership and had been organizing, rooted in community organizing around school closures, and so Rebecca, when we talked, oh my gosh, so many years ago now, you had talked, and you wrote about this as well in your book chapter about, being influenced and really learning and bringing that knowledge from participating in that 2012 strike in Arizona. And so I think it's important to understand like the significance of continuing to share these stories and to learn from each other.
Yeah, I didn't want to just come in and say, hey, the reason we had leverage and power is because of me. But it really was. I was a huge factor. And I don't like to talk about that though, but I other people can talk about it. That makes me feel better. But it is true. And there were times when we were organizing and I'd be in these spaces with field organizers from AEA. And even when they brought in NEA organizers, down the line, they looked to me. I was the only person in the entire room who had been on strike before. And so here's a fun caveat that might make you smile is I used to bring my copy of How to Jumpstart Your Union, and I carried it with me everywhere I went. And there was this one time, and I think Eric Blanc might have told this story at one time, but they were trying to figure out like how to count ballots and how do we do this in person. And I was like, hey, if you turn to page 127 in How to Jumpstart Your Union, you could read about how we did it in Chicago. And I explained how it went down in Chicago because I had participated. So thank you for saying that, but I don't love to start with things like that. So thank you.
Thank you to Michael for the, sorry.
I'll also say part of that question, Michael, too, I think comes in there was a lot of retaliation that happened in maybe everywhere, but we talk a little bit about charter legislation that came through, and then because West Virginia had that infrastructure, was able to organize around that. But in Oklahoma, there was a lot of retaliatory legislation that really kind of continued to just kind of beat down on teachers. And so that also, I think, has contributed to what's come after.
Thank you to Michael for the question. Thank you for everyone else who answered and really contributed to that rich answer there. Is there additional questions that folks would like to ask? Feel free just to come off mic and ask it of our presenters. Not hearing one, I'm going to ask an additional one because I had a whole set of canned questions, and literally throughout the presentation, I'm just cross it off, cross it off. You all really covered so many rich topics today. Could you speak to the influence of the Chicago teachers strike, if any, on some of the earlier, right? We heard it about Arizona as the fourth and final that you covered, but what about some of those earlier strike actions and union organizers?
I can maybe start. I think, the core group of folks in West Virginia who started the Facebook page and who had been very active in educator unionism were aware of the Chicago strike. I followed it, read about it, but I would say by and large, it doesn't seem like that was widely understood, at least in West Virginia, that there was sort of this continuity between the 1990 strike or the mine workers than it was really anything outside of the state's political history. And I think part of that is just because the process too, like Erin had mentioned, and like Rebecca's aware of, you in Chicago, it was starting with a rank and file caucus taking over union leadership at the local level, and then kind of building for a strike action after that as a means of like slowly progressing, flexing muscles, and then taking that action. Whereas in West Virginia, Kentucky, it sort of went the opposite way, where it was these rank and file movements weren't in that position of power to call for a strike action, but they were building up the momentum for it on their own, in their own independent way. And in West Virginia's case, of taking that action, building that power, and then trying to take over leadership from a rank and file caucus. And so I think because of that makeup, the fact that it also was a statewide action rather than a city-specific action also may have been some of the reasons why we see that the Chicago strike, while incredibly significant both to study and to understand how to build power, may not have been as influential in these specific states because they were relying more on their own history in that sense.
I want to add that I think that we can think about about its influence in another way, though, as well, because, and I think this speaks to something about how I feel that the wider labor movement, at times, teachers' movements are taken seriously, but I think sometimes there's an underestimation of how important, educator movements are to the wider labor movement. In 2011, the Wisconsin teachers engaged in sick-outs participated in occupying the Capitol, which a lot of people kind of point to as sort of the precursor to the Occupy movement. And that movement is really important in shifting, that's where we get the phrase like we are the 99%, right? And I think that has been really important in shaping that orientation and understanding of explaining our lives during economic recession, and and understanding how capitalism works. I think there were the public narratives that became more accessible and shifted in that time, and that certainly the 2012 Chicago Teachers Union strike was about that as well, and continues to be a beacon through which, Chicago and other places, but especially Chicago with their very, in 2019, going on strike for these very radical demands like rent control, like affordable rent, right? And sanctuary policies and mandatory naps for kindergarten, like these really kind of are contributing to these maybe in indirect ways and these broader ways that still filter down in our places to shifting the narratives into seeing what could be possible through educator union movements.
Wonderful. Thank you both. I'm going to pause one last time and see if there's additional questions from participants. If folks would like to just feel free to type in the chat or hop off mute and ask a question if you'd like. On that note, I know we've been on for a while, for a good hour and a half. Really want to thank both of our presenters today. I have pasted for those here a link to the book so you can read it, right? They provided not just a fantastic presentation, really rich information tonight, but also please go read their book itself. I found the introduction and preface, when I first encountered it, I literally just sat there and read on screen, which is difficult for me immediately because there was so many great stories and anecdotes and other information and analysis that they provide in the text. And for those who might be watching the video, we'll make sure to post a link as well so folks can find that easily. But on behalf of the Scontra Center, we want to thank you all for our first ever online book talk with Erin and Brendan. And thank you all for coming tonight as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.